Okay, we're on. It is the meet number 10 for the Comedy Writers Colony Saturday Writing Group. Um, July, 18th? So this week we moved over to talking about one of the hugest areas in all of comedy writing, and that is language play, language work. So for comedians, like I always tell people, there's the hard work of finding unique angles and that sort of original thought and things like that that give juice to comedy writing. But there's also all these side tributaries that you can go down that really have nothing to do with the ideas themselves, but there's comedy that just exists in them. And language is by far the biggest. There's no doubt that human beings get massive satisfaction out of language play and word play and letter play and all the things we'll talk about here in a minute. So being able to really focus in on language and look at that and glean that and harvest from that in order to get your comedy, a big thing, especially for professional writers. And so it's a huge area. There's tons of stuff going on here. Like literally, when I started doing just some of the research to form this up a little bit on ChatGPT, I asked it like how many types of wordplay are there, and it basically said, oh, there's easily over 250 individual types. And that's not even, there's probably more as you go in and start breaking apart the different types of language play that you can do. And this is in every language, across every culture. It's endless what we can do with language. And that's kind of where I started by talking about that there's standardized language, which every culture, every language has. So think of that as the dictionary version of language, where you can lay out the grammatical rules, the punctuation rules, the syntax, all these things that are rule governed, the meanings. But over on the other side, you find communicated language, how human beings actually use language. And that is exponentially larger than the way we have for standardized language. Because you can basically change entire meanings of entire phrases and sentences and paragraphs with a tone of voice or with emphasis on this part of the word versus that part of the word. There's just so much that you can do once you start adding in all the communication tools. So again, for comics, being sensitive to all that and knowing how to mix and match all these tiny little dials of language and communication, it's just fascinating how much it yields. So basically, we start with the concept that words are pliable. They're both rigid. In other words, they're standardized meanings for words. And if you use a non-standardized meaning for a word or use a word that your audience doesn't understand, it immediately fractures comedy. It fractures stand-up. Everybody instantly freezes up because they don't know what you're talking about with that symbol. So we all kind of have this rigid agreement that we kind of all use symbols in about the same way. The basic definitions don't jump around that much. But then it's also incredibly pliable. So as you start playing around with language, you start to realize like I can say something as simple as dog, D-O-G, very common word. But as soon as I say it, everybody gets, okay, dog, a noun, an animal. But that doesn't mean we both have the same image of a dog. Like I may have thought of a two-legged dachshund, which I've seen where the dachshunds sometimes get spinal injuries and then they have to have a cart, to get around. Uh, it's endless. And then you can be a verb, it can be an adjective, you can do all sorts of things with dog. And you can misspell it, you can change the spelling, you can add new content, new definitions with slang and with different cultures. And so words are incredibly creative, which is great for comedy and great for stand-ups and great for writers because it's just a huge palette to play with. Every time you get into a situation, there are word restrictions, and you see this quite a bit in comedy on things like profanity and vulgarity and obscenity, bodily terms, sexual terms, all the different things that, and sort of trigger terms, things that we say these words are so charged for a particular audience, at least, that you take them off the menu. This is huge in stand-up. One of the biggest problems that the general culture has with stand-up comedy is that stand-up has much less restrictions on the level of profanity and obscenity that they use. And some of them, it's constant. It's just sort of what they've committed to as far as how they do stand-up and how they do comedy. But for some cultures and some audiences, that immediately throws them out of the moment. And the language itself keeps them from actually accessing the comedy behind the language. So that was kind of where we started, that this is a massive area. And as a comedy writer, comedy producer, comedy creator, you need to get really familiar with language play, because the better you know it and the better your brain does it naturally, the more you are in the idiom and the art form of really good comedy writing. Because every time somebody says something, your brain will separate the words. And if there's one that stands out as having potential for comedy, you can lift it up and go back at it and add comedy to it. It's an amazing technique. My brain, I've been doing this, I've been fascinated with language since I was a kid. I was a heavy reader, then I turned into a writer. Then I got a PhD in rhetoric and undergrad in English and literature and journalism, because I just love words and I love writing. And so my brain has been playing these games for a long time, and it does it on its own, kind of independently, as I'll show you in just a second. So that's sort of a general conception of how to think about language and comedy. What most people try to do, and in some ways it's more effective, in some ways it's less effective, is to go into the actual tactics, the tiny tricks that language does over and over again that you can draw from and just use, without even understanding any type of theory underneath it or strategy. What are the tactics themselves? So, for example, in the class, we started with, I talked about chiasmus, which is a Greek word. Like if you look at these up as rhetorical devices or literary devices or figures, there's a massive list of just tiny structures that have evolved in language that you can use artfully or for effect in your writing. Chiasmus is when you flip a sentence. So the first part of the sentence is like this verb. The second part is sort of verb noun. So the most famous one is John F. Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So it's a flip, and that's a structure that you can use over and over again. When it becomes comedy, you can do things like, I wrote this back when Bill Clinton was in office and was getting impeached for having sex with his assistant. And he said, so the line became, ask not what you can do for your country, or ask not what your country can do for you, but how much of your country you can do. And so comedy wise, same chiasmus, but I've moved things a little bit out of order to get a joke out of it. And that's one of the other things, to the second major tactic that I use a lot is change outs. So you have three basic locations within grammatical structure of nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Or I guess is that grammar? It's not grammar. Noun, verbs, and adjectives. And you can change each one of those, or just one of those, or two of those in a sentence or in a construction, and create comedy. So just change the noun. Like, I went to the zoo and I saw a bear, versus I went to the grocery and I saw a bear. So the comedy just happens because you changed a noun or a verb or an adjective. So it's a really cool way to play in just this sort of linguistic space. It has nothing to do with meaning or reality or anything you've had to think about, but suddenly something funny happens just because you changed out and nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So think about playing with that one. Puns is what a lot of people think about when they come into language play. And the reason why puns are often groans instead of laughs, and dad jokes are often puns, is because they're creating a pun where there's a ton of space in between the original phrase and the new phrase. If there's just a tiny amount of space, then the pun will actually work as a joke, like a really clever comedy piece of comedy. For example, Cormac last week during the Stand Up Accelerator workshop, Casey was talking about how much she was into her dude, Rancher John, and she sort of created a sort of love story around it. And I was saying that it could be a romance novel, like you could do a parody of a romance novel as a comedy bit where she's talking about a rancher. And he said, yeah, it'd be 50 Shades of Hay. And the reason that works is because 50 Shades of Gray and 50 Shades of Hay are just a tiny bit different. And so it doesn't look like you've tortuously drugged out the meaning over to here to get to that pun. So when you can find puns really close like that, puns are really clever. And again, they're fun to play with. There are all sorts of others, and I'm not going to go into exact detail, but if you chat GPT, all this stuff, it's all in there. One that I talked about that I think is kind of interesting with language play is that they all come up with their own individual names. Like you kind of have to memorize what these weird names for these tactics mean. Like there's one called a mondegreen, and that's a mishearing. And so when somebody says something, you mishear it as something different. And there's a lot of examples of this from pop music, like "Excuse me," like in the Jimi Hendrix song, "Excuse me while I touch the sky," or whatever it is, and now it's become "Excuse me while I kiss this guy." That's a mishearing. And if you ever want to make little kids laugh, do a mishearing. So ask them their name, and they'll say, "I'm Johnny," or whatever, and you say, "So you're Billy?" And they will lose their minds to try to correct you. And then they'll see that it's play, that it's naming play, and they'll get into it. It's one of the first things, types of split between a referent, like what the word, the sign points to, the term itself, uh, and the referent, that there's a distance in between them. And the kids get a lot of pleasure out of learning that. So there's a lot of naming work you can do as language play, very popular. But a mondegreen is when you mishear. The reason it's named that is there's a woman in the 1950s who wrote an article for Atlantic Monthly, and her name was, I can't remember what her name was. I have to look this up. If you want to look it up, you can look up under the history of mondegreens. But she talked about when she was growing up, there was a poem that she heard a lot about. They killed Lord Haley and laid him on the green. And what she heard was they killed Lord Haley and Lady Mondegreen. So in her mind, it was they killed the Lord and then his lady. They killed them both. So it became known as a mondegreen, but it's a mishearing and really a good technique. I do this a lot when I do crowd work. Somebody will say something and I'll just instantly change the word as if I heard something different. The other side of that is a malaprop, which is a misspeaking. So instead of mishearing something for the comedy, you misspeak it for the comedy. So instead of complimenting somebody, you hear an insult. So lots of those things you can do. The last one, and then we're going to pop out of this because I don't want to make these too long, that I do a lot to train my brain to stay in as a comedy writer is letter play. And what this means, I'll do two. There's letter play, which is change out the first letter of words, and suddenly they become funny. Even if there's nothing in that word that's funny at the moment, if you change the first sound, the prefix, into a new prefix, it will just generate new jokes. And these are a really good way to write super clever jokes without even have to think. So, for an example, bohemians. I always thought that was an interesting word. I don't know where it came from. I guess it's German, bohemian, and I like, or it could be French, but I liked the way it sounded. So one day I was just sitting there and just running out new letters. So brohemian could be, a dude like who's aggro and whatever, sort of also bohemian. And I went down the letters until I got to fohemian, fohemian, which is a fake hemian, a fake bohemian, which fits very well in describing Austinites. They act like they're bohemians where they have an open lifestyle and don't follow laws and don't care about money, but it's kind of a pose. So fohemian became a joke. And that's just letter play. So you can train your brain to do that. And the last is tagging play or countering play, where you hear a song or you hear a saying and you add a new line at the end of it. So it's kind of sentence play instead of just straight up word play. So I do this a lot with, I think the example I used in class was if you go back to old sayings like time heals all wounds, unless you get smashed in the head with a clock. Sometimes it causes wounds, which get healed in time. So it's tagging. So no matter what somebody says or what comes your way or what you read in the media or what somebody says in conversation, you can always tag it with a sentence that changes the meaning of the sentence that came before it. Very fun to do. And again, if your brain can do it fast, people are very impressed with it as language play. Okay, so that's it. Meet 10. There's a lot in here. Again, like when I start doing these as full modules that are fully produced, I have to make sure not to overwhelm people because this chapter and this meeting become very overwhelming. It's the most technical kind of comedy writing in some ways because there's so many tactics and so many very micro things that you have to learn in order to do it well. So there you go. That's Meet 10. We'll be back next week with Meet 11, which we may talk about absurdity this coming week, which I think would be maybe a nice balance, a little bit easier than language work.